Hello and welcome to the show. For the next half an hour, we will discuss the most important economic stories of the week. We try and help you understand economic policies a little better, as well as apprising you of the most important economic stories of the week. Whether you're an investor, a consumer, an entrepreneur, or just someone who wants to understand economic policy a little better, this is the show to watch. You're watching Policy Watch, and I'm Athar Khan. As we do every week, we've decided to zero in on three stories. We'll start with the beautiful Swiss setting of Davos, where the World Economic Forum starts this month. On the sidelines of the summit, trade and commerce ministers from key industrial nations will meet and discuss economic policy and mutual cooperation. We'll move on to the landmark Vodafone judgment passed by the Supreme Court of India, ordering the IT department to pay back the bank guarantee that the company had deposited, as well as clearing Vodafone of any liability in paying tax on its deal with Hutchison SR. The top story of the week, however, will be the RBI's quarterly review. And this week, I'll be in conversation with Mythili, Bhusnurmath, consulting editor of the Economic Times. A very warm welcome to the show, Mythili. We'll start the show, if I could, with Davos. There's been a lot of talk of reshaping and rebuilding capitalism this time around. Record number of registrations as well. Initial thoughts on Davos this year?
Well, Athar, to be very honest, I'm increasingly becoming a skeptic of Davos. It always was a talk shop of the elite, but in the earlier environment when that talk shop did seem to kind of generate fairly good economic growth across the world, and the elite did seem to kind of share, the prosperity was getting shared by the vast majority who did not really, were not participating certainly at Davos and were not part of that elite. It still, there was some justification. But if you see the present crisis that the world has been going through, the economic crisis dates back to August 2008. And that means this is the fourth Davos summit that we are seeing since then. And these leaders and the top corporate leaders, top political leaders have been just talking. So it increasingly seems like a talk shop of the elite. And understandably, there's a great deal of anger. So like the Occupy Wall Street, we are seeing the Occupy Davos sentiment, and they're asking a very legitimate question. Where are the remaining 6.9999 billion, which I thought was a very well put way of, putting it across, the resentment across the world. So clearly the earlier model has failed, and that was pretty evident even 4 years ago. And since then we've had 4 Davos summits, we've had the G20, and what have they achieved? Very little. So I think until we realize that it can no longer be a preserve only of the elite, because Davos is only by registration, and you have to pay a huge amount. And though Klaus Schwab has done a done a remarkable job by getting this little remote village in Switzerland into the limelight.
Put on the world map.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But increasingly you're wondering, who is it? Is it the elite talking to the elite, and have they lost their relevance? I'm wondering that unless they do something more by way of concrete action, I think Davos will just be one of those has-beens and it'll just disappear.
Right. Mythili, the other big news coming out of Davos is the Google statement saying that we cannot monitor the whole World Wide Web, obviously. Now, with regard to India, because we've had problems, the government has had problems with Google on this issue, what should a progressive or so-called progressive government, what should their line be on this particular issue?
I think on this, I'm with Google, because in case there is something objectionable and somebody raises an objection, Google has always said we're willing to take it off. But it really cannot be a moral policeman. And if you see, I think Indians, we tend to have very thin skins. We don't like anybody poking fun at us. We're not able to see the lighter side of things. And that becomes a little ridiculous. So I'm entirely with Google on this, and not certainly with the big brother attitude of the government.
We'll come back to Davos in just a bit. Now, the World Economic Forum kicks off in Davos this month, and trade ministers from key countries including India, Brazil, China, the US, and the EU converge on the Swiss Alps to meet on the sidelines of the summit. The absence of a breakthrough in the ongoing Doha round of global trade talks has resulted in some developed countries pushing for limited trade opening pacts in select sectors involving just a few important countries. India plans to oppose these attempts by these developing countries to sign a limited market opening pact, and will also call for a check on rising protectionism. The Doha round of trade talks has reached an impasse, with countries like India, China and Brazil refusing to give in to the demand, the US demand of opening up their markets more than the others. Mythili, if I could ask you this, rising protectionism has been a concern for us, and India is going to rake the issue up at Davos. Now, how bad would it be for India if this limited market opening plans of the US were actually implemented?
No, clearly for us, multilateralism is far better than any kind of limited, whether it's bilateralism or, a number of countries, a few select countries coming together. Because we are, especially if you look at trade, even though we have become increasingly globalized and trade has become a larger part of our economy, in the world scheme of things, we are a very small player. So given that we really don't have much bargaining strength, we have a lot of noise, make a lot of noise. But in fact, in terms of bargaining strength and economic clout in international trade arena, we have very little. So clearly multilateralism is better for us. But as long as the world economy is going through the kind of crisis and the kind of slowdown that we are seeing, you will see protectionism rising across the world. And mind you, though we love to complain, India is amongst the highest users of anti-dumping provisions. So I think a little bit of, we need to kind of practice what we preach, and nobody's going to take us seriously unless we do that.
But Davos, if we talk about Davos, every year it happens. And like you said, it's the ruling ground of the elite, and nothing really trickles down to our economy, and we don't really benefit from it. Is there a way out of it? Is there a way to make events like Davos actually effective?
Well, maybe if they could perhaps rope in the NGO movement a little bit and not limiting it only to the elite and not charging such high registration fee and showing that, there's the leaders and the corporate leaders who are willing to do something concrete, because even the G20 you've seen in the crisis when the first G20 meet was held in Washington, there was a lot of determination to do something. But once the world economy seemed to come out of the absolute crunch of the crisis, then everybody's gone back into their shells. So I think we need to see more concrete action. Global finance needs to take a back seat, because the moment we talked about Basel III and you find the big banks, the large 5 multinational banks, which have systemic implications, when they've been asked to kind of keep additional capital, we have the head of JP Morgan Chase saying that no, there's no need, we're no longer a systemic risk. So I think people need to kind of put their money where their mouth is and then be a little bit more sincere. If they were to do that, I think people will go along and not see Davos as an exclusive club, ruling out the
right. And isn't
numbers.
It time that the countries like the US and the EU started listening to, say, India, say, Brazil, and our valid demands? Right now, it's just an impasse, like we mentioned in the Doha talks. Isn't it time that the big economies, the US, the EU, started listening to what we have to say?
Well, Athar, it's essentially he who pays the piper plays the tune. So the US is the largest economy in the world. Not only the largest economy, but the largest geopolitical power. So I think it will be very difficult for us to make the US see sense, quote unquote, unless all of us are united. But the problem is each one of us has very different interests.
Right.
Brazil is a commodity exporter, we are not.
Right.
China's interests are very diverse from us. So I think it will be a long time before the whole world were to kind of not gang up, but speak with one voice against the US. So until that happens, I think we really need to have some kind of compromise rather than anything else.
Right.
And the US
find a middle ground.
Find a middle ground, absolutely.
Right. Fair point. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But we have to take a short break right now. After the break, we look at the other big story of the week, the Vodafone judgment. We'll have that right after the break. Don't go anywhere. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're still watching Policy Watch. Now, the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of the Vodafone Group, the world's biggest mobile phone operator, in its fight against a rupees 12,000 crore claim by the taxman. It has also ordered the Income Tax Department to return 2,500 crore with 4% interest and a bank guarantee of 8,500 crore deposited by Vodafone when the hearings began. The decision, widely lauded by legal eagles and analysts for its wisdom, is expected to be a watershed development, paving the way for resolution of other cases. Vodafone had bought a 67% stake in Hutchison SR from the Hong Kong-based Hutchison Whampoa in May 2007 through companies based in the Netherlands and the Cayman Islands for 11.5 billion, which is currently 55,000 crore rupees. Now, So, Mythili, this is a end of a long, drawn legal battle for Vodafone. Do you think this, at some level, there is justification and vindication in the Vodafone camp right now after this judgment?
Well, there's certainly a lot of elation in the Vodafone camp. And not only Vodafone, but a lot of the upper crust lawyers, tax practitioners who've been advising these MNCs also feel very vindicated. But as a taxpayer, though I can't fault the Supreme Court judgment because they've really followed the letter of the law. And particularly in tax statutes, that's what courts have tended to follow. But as a taxpayer of this country, my sympathies are entirely with the tax authorities. Because if you look at the logic of the judgment, there I feel that they certainly have a grouse against the judgment. And this is surprising because the Supreme Court, in many other cases, particularly if you look at Article 21, right to life and personal liberty, the Supreme Court has been widening the interpretation of these laws or whatever fundamental rights or whatever statutes we have. And in this case, it was clearly that the assets on which the company was deriving its income did lie in India. So frankly, there was every justification, which is why Bombay High Court did tell Vodafone that you have to pay up because they should have deducted the money while paying Hutch. But so the Supreme Court, I think, has opted to go strictly by the letter of the law. So, but the lesson in this clearly is to the tax authorities that you need to get your act together, do your homework properly. You know, you have general anti-avoidance agreements and those kind of things are possible, those kind of rules. So which many other countries have done it. But the idea is that in this particular case, you could argue that, okay, the entire complicated transaction was not done necessarily to avoid tax. But if you have a simple way of doing things and opt for the more complicated way of doing things, then clearly your antenna should be up, the tax antenna should be up. If I can touch my nose directly and I have to go around my head to touch my nose, then you must understand, why am I going around my head to touch my nose? Was there some ulterior motive? And I think that is where the Supreme Court perhaps, they went strictly by the letter of the law. So the tax authorities do need to plug this loophole.
So you think they missed a trick? The taxman did miss a trick somewhere while pursuing this case?
Yeah, I think the tax laws as they stand today do not perhaps entirely justify that demand. But so the lesson clearly is, make the amendment, change your laws quickly so that more and more companies don't do this. Because the argument that FDI, foreign direct investment, is going to come into India for this reason, I think is a very suspect argument. Because the foreign direct investment was already in India, the money had already come in. All that was happening now was a change of hands. And people don't come in, MNCs don't come into India trying to save tax. They come in for our market. If you look at the telecom companies, they've made money till very recently hand over fist. So if they're coming in for the market, not for the tax advantages. So pay your taxes and come in.
Fair point. You mentioned obviously that the FIR is already here. There's also a proposal in the budget apparently to plug that loophole via the whole DTC route. We'll get back to that. But before that, I want to ask you another question. What implication does it have on other pending cases like this? I think Sab Miller comes to mind immediately. Has the court judgment, the Supreme Court judgment, set sort of a precedent for cases like this now?
Yes, unfortunately for us, as I said, for taxpayers, the Supreme Court judgment always acts as a precedent. For all the cases that are pending, it may be a little difficult for the tax authorities to come in now because these transactions took place earlier. And though in the past tax authorities have made rules, laws, with retrospective effect, it does not set a very good example when you change laws retrospectively. But clearly you need to do it immediately so that future transactions are not done like this. And increasingly, I think we in India also need to clamp down on these tax havens. The Mauritius route, it's been argued again and again, needs to be shut down. But the government, I think, is more concerned about the quantity of the money coming in rather than the quality. I think it's high time, particularly because of terror implications of the money kind of coming in, all kind of suspect money coming in because of smuggling, all kind of things. I think worldwide, we do need to clamp down very heavily on all kind of tax havens.
But the Supreme Court has left a window open for the taxman. They have said that you can look into some, whatever cases that you find are irregular for that matter. You think that's enough for the taxman?
It becomes a little difficult. What is irregular is a very subjective argument. So again, if it goes to court, the Supreme Court would tend to go by the letter of the law, particularly in the light of this judgment. So I think we really don't have a moment to lose in the forthcoming budget. We need to plug this. We also need to act not only on Cayman. Mauritius is a huge area where most of our foreign investment comes in through Mauritius route. Why? Make it easy for people to come in directly. Remove the red tape, remove the bureaucracies, and then people will opt to come in. Because as I said, they're coming because of the markets, not because of the tax saving.
You mentioned foreign investors coming in. How would this judgment play on their mind now? I would like to call it their anxiety. Has that passed over, especially since the Supreme Court has ordered the taxman to pay the bank guarantee back to Vodafone?
No, clearly it shows that India does go by the law. So that is a big assurance for overseas investors. But I think what you need to do for overseas investors is remove the, as I said, the red tape, have clarity in policy, don't have chop and change. And the government, whether you look at K and Vedanta, why does government interfere? If it is a transaction between two private parties, and unless there is an issue of natural resources or there's an issue of tax, I think government should steer clear and not try to grab a piece of the cake only because they feel they're being left out.
Right. So you think after this judgment, obviously, the government said, Pranab Mukherjee came out with a statement saying we're studying the judgment, so did the Revenue Department, the IT Department. Do you think there is going to be a review petition filed at all?
I'm not so sure about a review petition and whether it will serve any purpose, because this was a 3-judge bench. Maybe you could have a petition by a larger bench. But most benches would tend not to deviate from this. So I think what is more important is not to fritter away your energy in a review petition, but to plug the loophole in the tax laws.
Right. Let me put you on the spot. Right decision, correct decision, yes or no?
Right decision going by the letter, but not the spirit of the law.
Right. We'll talk about our top story. The RBI's quarterly review, CRR has been slashed by 50 basis points. We'll talk about that and a lot more with Mythili Bhusnurmath right after the break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. You're still with Policy Watch. Now, despite conflicting signals in the run-up to the quarterly review, the RBI slashed the cash reserve ratio, or CRR, by 50 basis points in an effort to ease the liquidity crunch in the system. Interest rates, however, were left untouched, as expected, in a move that is being seen as a policy shift from fighting inflation to reviving growth. Our bureau filed a special report.
The Reserve Bank's quarterly review meeting was keenly watched by India Inc. In what is being seen as a shift in policy, the RBI slashed the cash reserve ratio, or CRR, by 50 basis points, coming down to 5.50%, while leaving the repo and reverse repo rates untouched. Even as analysts agree that slashing the CRR will ease the crunch in liquidity, the immediate reaction from India Inc. was that of caution, with most banks maintaining that going in for an immediate rate cut was unlikely. This gives no respite to home, auto and corporate loan borrowers in terms of their monthly equated installments, or EMIs. But with the RBI reducing the CRR, banks will have more money to lend. The central bank has chosen to keep the repo, the rate at which it lends to banks, unchanged at 8.5%, owing to the bleak economic outlook globally, as well as due to the deceleration in growth over the past year. The reverse repo, the rate at which RBI borrows from banks, remains unchanged at 7.5% as well. Experts believe that by holding out on a rate reversal, the RBI has firmly put the ball back in the government's court by urging for concrete policy reforms. And with assembly elections just round the corner, inertia on key policy initiatives like the DTC, GST and diesel deregulation is still expected to continue. Bureau Report, RSTV.
Well, Mythili, you saw that, and obviously we had a chat with about this before also, I think a couple of days ago. Do you think this decision of CRR slashing the CRR by 50 basis points, but not touching the repo and reverse repo, was the right decision at this point in time?
Well, I don't think the governor had too many choices because liquidity was tight. At the same time, inflation numbers are not really very much better. The slight dip that we are seeing is essentially in seasonal vegetables. So long term, it's very difficult to say whether inflation is really trending down on a sustained basis. So he really didn't have too many choices.
Plus, manufacturing inflation is also on the rise.
Absolutely. And if you look at it, the reason why my sympathies are with the Reserve Bank and the governor is because any country really has two levers of economic policy. One is the fiscal policy, which is in the government's domain, and one is monetary policy, which is in the central bank or the Reserve Bank's domain. Now, when one lever just doesn't do its job, that is a fiscal policy, because government is consistently overspending. In fact, they've just announced that they're going to be borrowing 1,000 billion more. So if you're going to do that kind of, overspending, then the other lever, monetary policy, has to overcompensate for the failure of the second lever to act. So this is what the RBI's dilemma is, and which if you read the Reserve Bank of India's review, they're constantly telling the government, look, unless you get your act together, unless you curtail your spending, unless you do something about fiscal deficit, there's very little that we can do, particularly because the rupee has been under pressure, global inflows have slowed down into the country. So my sympathies are really entirely with the governor.
Right.
The government just has to do its act. But because we have elections coming up, 5 assembly elections, UP being a very important state, and we just have that Karnataka High Court judgment saying that the minimum wages have to be given under the Manrega. So government spending is just going to grow further and further. So unless the government does something about cutting its subsidies, I think the Reserve Bank's hands are tied. And that is what is the basic thrust of the policy.
So the ball firmly back in the government's court, and I think the governor has played it really well, obviously.
Absolutely.
Also, there are some, even though there are people who say it's the right decision, came at the right time, there are some harsh critics of the move, slashing CRR. Could the Reserve Bank, could the governor have done something else as a monetary policy instrument, say intervention in the forex market? Would that have been a good option for them?
See, he already has been intervening, because if you look at when the rupee reached almost 54 to the dollar, they did intervene. And subsequently, the rupee has appreciated. It's now hovering somewhere near 50. But the RBI's options here again are limited, because though we have sizable reserves, especially if you compare to what we had in 1991, the fact is the bulk of these reserves have been built up through capital inflows, and capital inflows of the portfolio kind. And this is money that is easy come, easy go. So if you really were to try and battle against the depreciation of the rupee, you could soon find your reserves depleting entirely, which is why I think the governor, in fact, really doesn't have too many choices. Maybe what he could have done, perhaps, is cut the repo rate by a small 25 basis points rather than cut CRR. Because in the process, what you've done, when you've increased liquidity and you have a government just waiting to grab this liquidity, then you'll find banks again lending to government. Because at the end of the day, lending to government is safer than lending to any corporate, because government is the sovereign.
Obviously.
So that is why I think maybe this is not perhaps the best of steps.
Right.
But when you have a government which is kind of clearly dominating fiscal policy, dominating monetary policy, and the Reserve Bank is the underdog.
Right. So this has been seen by most critics and otherwise like as a shift, a possible shift from an anti-inflationary stance to a pro-growth stance. Now, can a pro-growth stance, my question to you, and this is for me personally as well, can a pro-growth stance actually be an anti-inflationary stance at the same time?
Well, it could, if it's pro-growth increases supply, because if you see initially the inflation was entirely supply-driven. So if the pro-growth stance eases the constraints on supply, it could be anti-inflationary. But my fear is that it'll again be mopped up by the government and spent on revenue expenditure. If the government were to use this money to create capital investment, that means increase the growth triggers for the economy, then you would find supply easing, and then maybe inflation coming down.
But isn't the RBI fueling aggregate demand, as some critics have pointed out, by doing this?
Yes, but as I said, because the government is not playing its part, the RBI has to do something to ease the liquidity. The hope is that when you ease liquidity, private corporate sector will also step up its demand, especially investment demand.
Right.
Let's see if that hope is kind of
like staying on the critics of this policy and this step. People have said, and I was reading edit pages a couple of days back, and very prominently some very senior journalists, some really senior economic journalists have said that this wasn't really a move to ease the liquidity crunch. It was actually bait for FIIs to come in, and because CAD is going all over the place, a yawning deficit, current account deficit, there's actually a bait for FIIs. Do you think that's true? Do you think there's any merit in that criticism?
No, I really don't think that is a criticism, because if the idea of increasing liquidity, typically when you increase liquidity, your interest rates will come down. So the FIIs are looking for debt. They would not come. And whether that you'll find FIIs coming into the equity market, I don't think it's a function so much of liquidity in India as global liquidity. And there I think Ben Bernanke has just sent the message that he's going to keep interest rates very low. So global liquidity is again on the upsurge, which is not necessarily a good thing for us long term, because again you might find assets bubble building up all over again, whereas we want sustained growth. We don't want to see the kind of ups and downs that you've seen in Latin America, because we're a democracy, and we need to have maybe a lower growth, not 10%, but 8% sustainable over 20 years, 30 years. That would be far better than 10% one year, 6% the next year.
Do you see any easing of the rates happening at all? I know you mentioned the election is going to be very difficult for the government, but when do you see it happening, if at all?
Well, it all depends. There's so much uncertainty in the world today, Athar, that you really cannot say how policy is going to pan out. If your inflows are very high, then you might find the government doing something, the Reserve Bank doing something. So at the moment, I think there are far too many uncertainties, a global crisis, Euro crisis in particular, global inflows, what the US does. The US economy looks as if it's recovering, but how dependent is it on the crutch of liquidity? There are too many uncertainties. But if the economy recovers, if the government does well, in the elections the Congress party does well, then maybe you will find them doing something sincere about reforms. And that could perhaps give courage to the Reserve Bank to ease up on monetary policy. If you see a cutting of oil subsidies, because after these elections, you still have 2 years to the next general elections. So there's no reason for the government to funk it.
Mythili, you're almost out of time, but I'll give you one last question before we go. Where do you see growth going this year? I know the government projections are anywhere from 7% to 8.5%, but in your opinion, realistically, what can one expect growth-wise?
If you're talking about the calendar year or the fiscal year?
I'm talking about the fiscal year.
So 11-12.
11-12.
Yeah, 7% I think is what the RBI, and I would tend to stick with that, maybe a little below 7, also between 6.5 and 7. And the next year also, if the IMF, the World Bank, everybody's been downgrading their estimates. So I think even the next year, 7% I think is perhaps the best we can hope for.
Right. Like you heard Mythili just say, 7% is probably the best we can hope for in this fiscal. Also, by slashing CRR, the government seems to have the ball right in their court. The governors played this one beautifully. Thank you, Mythili, Bhusnurmath, for joining us on Policy Watch. We'll have another special guest next week, and we'll discuss top 3 stories of that week as well. Till that time, thank you so much, and thanks for watching.